Across the UK, online and on DAB.
A radio star is born.
You're going to love
Talk Radio.
Little cowboy baby of the old corral.
Really?
Cowboy
Really?
baby of the old corral.
How... I frequently... This is Iain Lee, this is Talk Radio. Good evening. I frequently joke I have enough bands. When I write articles for Record Collector magazine, as I do occasionally, you have to write a little bio to go in the start. And I write, I've got enough bands, thank you. I don't need any more. And yet every now and then, it happens less frequently the older I get, right? But every now and then, a new band will pop up, or generally an old band, and I go, oh, flippin' heck, how have I missed this? How have I missed this? The Beatles were asked in 1968, who's your favourite singer? Nielsen. Who's your favourite band? Nielsen. And I never really got into Harry Nilsson. Couldn't do it. Tried a couple of things and just couldn't do it. And I bought the box set for about 35 quid of all of his RCA albums, and I've had it sitting in my spare room for ages and ages and ages and ages. And then someone on Twitter, I forget who it is, apologies, but someone on Twitter said, oh, have you seen this Nielsen book, The Life of a Singer Songwriter by Alyn Shipton? He might make a good guest. And I had just started to work my way through the RCA box set, and I thought, oh, okay. And I got in touch with Alyn Shipton, and I got hold of a copy of this book, which is brilliant, by the way. And I was sucked in immediately. And I don't know if it's reading the book. I don't know if I'm just at the right place, but I'm working through these albums, and man alive, they're flipping brilliant. I'm really pleased Alyn Shipton's on the line now. Evening, Alan.
Hello.
How are you doing? You all right?
Yeah, fine, and lovely to hear that song, which was written by Nielsen's mum.
It was Nielsen's mum, wasn't it? A little, it's adorable. I love it. Lovely little 1:24. And that's from one of the early albums, the first or the second one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the second one. But his mother was a huge influence on him, and yet every time that she nearly got successful, she walked away from it, and that, I think, motivated him not to be like that.
I am struggling to think, apart from John Lennon, a singer-songwriter that is more profoundly impacted by their parents, because there are so many, you got the song there obviously by his mum, but then there are so many songs referencing his, really screwed up relationship with his dad.
Yes, I mean, that was the whole point, and his dad was quite a character, really. I mean, a lot of the Nielsen family is still alive because his dad, what happened was his dad went off as a merchant sailor during World War II, and Harry's mum was so devastated by his dad's disappearance that she made up all these stories. So she said, wow, he's a fighting Seabee. He's fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. He's a hero. Oh, he's dead. When he wasn't dead, he was living in New Jersey with another wife and a new family. And poor old Harry didn't know this until he had his first hit and suddenly got a letter from his dad saying, man. Hello, Harry. And you can imagine the devastation of that. So all his early years were writing songs about having no dad, and all his later years were dominated by songs about what terrible people dads were.
It really is. I mean, I've been aware of Harry Nilsson because I'm a big Monkees fan and I'm a big, Beatles fan, and I'm fascinated by the Beatles, not necessarily their solo music, but what they got up to in the 70s. And Nilsson's name just kept popping up and popping up. But it's going to those first 3 or 4 albums are absolutely stunning. When was the first one? About 67, something like that?
The first RCA album was 67.
Yeah.
He'd done quite a lot before that. I mean, he's kind of bobbling around in the music scene, but he was actually working as a bank computer operator. He was very early into computers, and he was mathematically very clever. So there's this guy whose mum, as well as having been abandoned by the dad and made up all these stories, was also an expert at bouncing checks and using fraudulent credit cards. So a lot of his childhood was spent scudding from New Jersey or Long Island to the West Coast. Then she'd bounce one check too often. They'd shoot back to the other side of the states, hoping to avoid the creditors. And she narrowly avoided imprisonment a couple of times. But it's obviously a very difficult childhood. And then, Harry starts making songs, and he didn't sleep very much as a kid. So here he is, 20 years old, working in a bank as a computer operator. Like his mum, he'd faked his credentials to get the job. 6 months in, they said, you don't appear to have this school diploma. And he said, well, actually, I'm quite good at maths, so if I'm good at the job, why fire me? And they kept him on and promoted him. And before he left the bank to become a songwriter, he was running a computer team of about 15 programmers. So not a stupid man by any means.
No, a very bright man. The first few RCA albums, they are so unlike anything else that was out at that time. So you're 67, 68, 69, you've kind of got your acid rock, you've got your psychedelia, you've got your bubblegum pop, you've got, and they kind, and I'm embarrassed. I've only just listened to them in the last couple of months. Where have I been all my life? But they're these beautiful. Well, they're hard to define. They're kind of orchestral. They're lush. They're a little bit folky. They seem just completely out of place with what was going on in the music world.
They are, and I think the man who really realised this was happening was Derek Taylor, who'd been the Beatles' publicist. And Derek he'd had a bit of a falling out with Brian Epstein, and in 1967, just before Epstein died, he'd gone to work in LA promoting a number of bands in the States. And he came across Harry. He was literally in the supermarket, and like a lot of dads, he thought, oh, God, I'm going to leave the family doing the shopping. I'll go and sit in the car. I sat in the car, turned the radio on, and suddenly he heard Harry Nilsson. And here's this song, 1941, which is one of the classic Being Deserted by a Dad songs that Nielsen, as we said, made such a habit of. And Derek thought, I've never heard anything like this. So the first thing he did is to ring George Harrison, who at that point was sitting in Blue Jay Way in the house he wrote the song about. And he said, you've got to hear this bloke Nielsen. And so gradually the legend spread through the Beatles. And Derek was the guy that took the albums back to the UK and got Lennon, McCartney, all the Beatles listening to Harry. And hence the favourite group that you talked about at the beginning of the piece.
I love Derek Taylor. Boy, oh boy. My two slight tangent, if you'll indulge me. My two favourite characters in the Beatles kind of circle are Derek Taylor, who is just the most wonderful king of the bullshine, isn't he? I think he was the first person to call Brian Wilson a genius in print, which then became the huge myth. But also, are you aware of Magic Alex?
No.
Oh, Magic Alex, right? I want someone to make a film or something, but I can't find anything about him. Magic Alex worked at Apple, and he was this Greek inventor, right? This young lad, and he basically went up to John Lennon and said, "John, I'm an inventor. I can make pretty much anything out of electronics. I can make you." This was in the days of like 4, I think maybe 8-track studios. He said, "I can make you a 126-track studio." And there won't be any, kind of shields around any of the instrument. It'll all be done with lasers. And John Lennon was like, whoa, yeah, okay, man. And he paid him loads of money to build this studio. And, of course, it was complete nonsense. He didn't have a clue. I think the only thing Magic Alex managed to make work was this little black box with red random flashing lights on. Oh, he's such a wonderful character.
My Derek Taylor story, just while we're on
go on.
So in the late 60s, around the time that he was working with Harry, we come into the 70s, and in 1972, Derek's now working for Warner Brothers as a talent scout, and he signs George Melly. And I actually played in George's band at the beginning of the 70s.
Did you really?
Working with, I was Det for his regular bass player, but there I was working with George. So Derek, we met, and he was at New Merlin's Cave in Clerkenwell doing sessions with George, and George was the kind of cult figure at that stage, kind of white middle-class guy who sang the blues like Bessie Smith and fell off the stage extremely drunk at the end of the show, doing Frankie and Johnny. I mean, it was great being with George, and I never thought of saying to Derek, who else are you working with?
Yeah.
The only person he would gush about until the cows came home was Bette Midler, because at the same time he was producing Harry Nilsson, which he went on to do, he was also making Bette's first album. So Derek was going, I've got this fantastic singer in the States, Bette Midler, you've got to hear Bette Midler. And he didn't say, and by the way, I'm also making a little touch of Schmilson in the Night with Harry.
The thing, you're not in any of the, because George Melly pops up in this book. You weren't in any of those scenes, were you?
Sadly not, no. I mean, I was trying to be a student at the time, and George came down and played with our band in Oxford, and then occasionally I did gigs with him. But
how cool.
But it was good fun.
Yeah, I bet.
George, at that
George
stage.
Melly was brilliant. What a character. Nielsen, I think, was ruined for me a bit with the Everybody's Talking and Without You, because there were such huge hits. And we talked about this on the show last night. Someone said, I can't stand that song. And I said, I couldn't stand Without You in particular. But I've been listening to it again since reading your book. And it is actually, it's one of the most incredible pop songs, whatever you want to define it as, with an amazing vocal. And it's just one of those songs that we've heard too often.
I think that's true.
It becomes wallpaper.
If you go back and listen to Badfinger's version of it, you realise just what a genius Harry was to turn the song into that great hit. I mean, the downside of it is, as you'll know from the book, that Derek Taylor said, well, of course, it was a one-take wonder because when he hit the high note, he had an attack of piles.
and it is
late night radio. I can say.
Yeah,
that.
we can say whatever we want. And it is. We're going to go to a break in a second. We'll come back and we'll talk a bit more. And we'll talk about your Billy J. Kramer book as well, because bizarrely we had a phone call last week from someone who phoned up apropos of nothing and said, my mum used to go out with Billy J. Kramer, so that's why you piqued my interest. It is also the Nielsen story. It starts off. The music career starts off so triumphantly. His life as a kid is pretty miserable, but it descends into sadness quite quickly. You know, there's the boozing and the drugging, and we all kind of think, oh, yeah, rock and roll. But the fun element, if there can be such a thing of the boozing and the drugging, goes pretty quickly, and it gets pretty messy very soon, doesn't it?
It does, but you see, I think one of the things I learnt, that's all been the image I had of Harry, and my impression of it was like you. The first 3 or 4 albums are great, and then it's a kind of skid row and nothing quite comes up to it. When you actually listen to those later albums and you take away knowing about the story and you just listen to them, funnily enough, there's some crackingly good songs there, and it's perhaps our prejudice about the fact that the early albums are just full of brilliant invention. The later ones, it's not quite so inventive, but my goodness, there are some great songs. There's a wonderful collaboration with Dr. John later on.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I was lucky enough, Harry's son Keith actually gave me the cassettes that Harry'd made of working out those songs with Dr. John. Wow. And it's wonderful to hear them sort of gradually evolving as the two of them, who were probably enjoying a little bit of substance abuse on the way, make these extraordinary songs come to life. And 2 or 3 of them are really rather good.
I bizarrely, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, I got talking with what's the gentleman's name? Bill Martin, I think it is. William.
Oh, yeah.
We had a little email exchange because I was trying to find something else. And he said, I've got these unreleased demos that I recorded with Harry Nilsson, and I'd love to get them out. And I just started kind of striking up conversations with him via email that when he passed away, and boy, oh boy, wouldn't it be great to get hold of some of those things? Well,
Bill Martin, of course, is famous in the book because Harry did some promo shots of him and made Bill wear a bear suit. Harry was one of the first people to record Simon Smith and the Amazing Dancing Bear, his version not quite as successful as Alan Price's. But part of it was to persuade his mate Bill to dress up in a bear and be photographed in a bear suit. And Bill said it took, about three weeks to get rid of the smell.
Alan, stay there. I'm going to come back to you in a second. I've got to pay the bills. I'm talking to Alyn Shipton, who's written just the most wonderful rock biography. And even I'm a big fan of rock biographies. Even if you're not a fan of Nielsen, this is a good entree into the world of Nielsen. And it's just a remarkable story of, talent and, the damage that booze and drugs can do to it, but actually real talent. The book is Nielsen, The Life of a Singer Songwriter. It's Alyn Shipton. It's Alyn spelled Alyn. We'll come back. We'll talk a bit more after this.
Unmissable late night radio with the original king of unconventional conversation.
Make contact with Iain Lee.
Late night Iain Lee on Talk Radio. We'll get you talking.
Evening, don't call in just yet. Give us 10 minutes or so, because I'm having a nice little chat with Alyn Shipton, who's written this brilliant book, Nielsen, The Life of a Singer-Songwriter. I've interviewed Alyn both. I was lucky enough to meet a Beatle. I got to interview Ringo once. Ringo and Mickey Dolenz, and I both spoke to them, and Nielsen came up in the conversation, and they both said, if Harry knocked on your door and said you fancy going out for a drink, you should probably take your passport with you, and you wouldn't be back home for a week.
Known as the Nielsen Ride.
And he would just whisk people off, wouldn't he?
Well, funnily enough, I had lunch in London last week with one of the most inveterate Nielsen riders of all, who's the film director Stanley Dorfman.
Right.
Stanley used to produce Top of the Pops for BBC television, but he moved to LA years and years ago, and he made a lot of videos with Harry. But in the very early 70s, he made an in-concert film with Harry for BBC Telly.
Yeah.
And Harry, who didn't like performing live, said that he would only do it if he did it without an audience. And Stanley said, yeah, that's fine. They were in LA, and Harry said, well, how are you getting back to the UK? He said, oh, well, I've got a flight from New York. I've got a flight in a couple of days. And Harry said, well, let's drive. Let's drive from LA to New York.
Brilliant.
And Stanley said, oh, I don't know about that. Harry said, oh, come on, just do it. So he didn't have a car, and he discovered that if you hired a car, it's very difficult back in the 70s to hire a car in one state and drop it off in another.
Yeah.
So being Harry, he rang up Jimmy Webb, the songwriter, and he wrote Up, Up and Away.
Yeah, of
and he said to Jimmy, can I borrow your Jaguar for the afternoon? And Jimmy said, yeah, sure. And he lent them this absolutely pristine XJ6, and the two of them get in it. And it arrived back at Jimmy's house on a flatbed truck a month later, completely totaled. Nielsen paid to have it put back together, but the story of the journey.
Well, there's a book in that. It's in your book, but there's a movie in that, because there's jail, there's drugs, there's gambling, there's losing all their money. It's an incredible road trip.
It is, and they're just about to go into New York when Nielsen says to Stanley, have you ever seen the Niagara Falls? And he says, no. So they turn left.
And very, very quickly, last thing on Harry. You mentioned that he didn't like playing live. He never did concerts. Again, completely out of step with, what was happening in, when Woodstock and rock concerts were becoming big events in the late 60s and the 70s. He shunned it. What was that? Was that fear? Was it he just... Why didn't he do concerts?
I think there was an element of fear, and certainly his second wife said that was part of the problem. But actually, the more I find out about Harry, the more I discover he wanted to live a completely normal private life. And if you look at the album covers, you never really see what Harry looked like at the time on any of them.
Yeah.
So he's either a drawing of himself as a kid, by the time the first album came out with a picture of him as a bank clerk, he didn't look like that anymore. And fundamentally, in all of them, he's slightly in disguise. And by never appearing live, and even when he was on television, to some extent cultivating a different image from the way he looks. He could walk around LA unrecognised, have a lovely family life, and just be a very rich and wealthy man who was selling 6 million copies of Nielsen Schmielsen without anyone noticing.
I'm looking at your website, alynshipton.co.uk, and again, it's Alyn with A-L-Y-N. And you've written loads of books. They're mainly jazz and blues books. What prompted you to do Nielsen and then the Billy J. Kramer book you've got out?
Well, two things, really. One is that I suppose if you're going to be Pontian academic about it, you'd say I'm an oral historian. And I started out in the 80s doing the stories of a lot of African-American jazz musicians who I thought, if somebody doesn't do it, their stories will never get published. So I co-edited or co-wrote some and commissioned a lot of others. I was a publisher in those days and managed to, in some ways, preserve the memories of a generation. And then, just at the beginning of the 2000s, I met George Shearing, the pianist. And George, lovely guy, came from London, had a house in Oxfordshire, but actually lived in New York, and he'd been a great hero in New York. Blind pianist, and George said, I'd like you to help me write my memoirs. And I suddenly thought, gosh, there are all these wonderful British musicians who ought to be written about. So that's what led eventually to Billy Joe Kramer, which you might come on to. But the Harry story is quite different. In another life, I'm a Radio 2, Radio 3 producer, and I was making a Radio 2 series for BBC Radio about Richard Perry, the record producer. Now, very, very interesting character. Of course, he produced Nielsen, Schmielsen, and Son of Schmielsen. He also produced Ringo's solo albums, on which Harry sings. He produced Carly Simon's You're So Vain, on which Harry and Mick Jagger are the backing voices. So Richard was completely knitted into the Harry Nilsson story. And I remember saying to Richard, I love Harry's work. Is there a book? And Richard said, no, and there never will be. And I said, why? He said, because Harry's widow was very upset when he died, and everything's just been locked away, and the Nielsen estate just don't want anybody going there. And I thought, well, biographer's dream, if all the stuff's there.
Yeah.
And so 5 years later, and after a lot of mulling around in LA to find the right people to talk to them, to gain their trust, I ended up getting permission to write the book. And I must say, all credit to the family, because they're fantastically helpful.
It's a cracking book. Nielsen, The Life of a Singer Songwriter. It's flipping brilliant. You could, up until quite recently, get the whole RCA box set, 18 albums, I think, with bonus tracks. It was retailing for £35. I think it's much more expensive than that now, but what a bargain that box is. Billy J. Kramer, now what is this? Because it's his autobiography, but you've co-written it or something.
This is the oral history thing. So you become the co-writer or the editor or the ghostwriter. This all came out of Nielsen, actually, because the man who's the catalyst for this is Frank Stallone, brother of Sylvester, songwriter, singer, and for a long time Harry Nilsson's next-door neighbour in Bel Air.
I love it.
I went to interview Frank about Nielsen because on the day that John Lennon was killed, Nielsen was producing an album on which Frank was singing.
Right.
And he was singing in the studio, and he suddenly looked through the glass, and everybody the other side of it looked as if they'd been shot. Well, they hadn't, but Lennon had.
Wow.
And so he's actually got these very acute memories of the immediate response of Harry and a lot of the musicians who played, because many of the Nielsen albums, many of the Paul McCartney solo albums, the Ringo albums at that time had the same basic crew of musicians on them. So, Jim Keltner, a lot of the guys who were LA session players were on all those albums. They were all there in the studio that day, and they reacted, as you can imagine, with horror to Lennon's death. So I got to know Frank quite well. And just after the book came out, he rang me and said, I've got this friend you might have heard of called Billy J. Kramer who wants to write his memoirs, and he's not quite sure how to go about it, and maybe you can help. So he introduced us. I went to see Billy, and we got on like a house on fire.
Yeah, you very kindly sent me a copy of the book, and as soon as I finish Nielsen, which I almost have done, I don't want this book to finish, but as soon as I have, I'm going to crack on with it. Any surprises that came up with Billy J. Kramer? Anything that made you take a step back and go, God, well, I never knew that about him.
Lots of things, really, but the thing there are two things about it that made it really interesting to do. The first thing is that Billy was managed by Brian Epstein. He was produced by George Martin. He was recorded by Hurricane Smith. And the songs were written for him by Lennon and McCartney. So he's living in this completely parallel universe to the Beatles. He actually knew them as a teenager. He'd grown up in the same area. He'd met them before they went to Hamburg. So he's got this kind of completely parallel career to the Beatles. And through the same management, and actually touring a lot with them at the time, he's both a fly on the wall looking at their careers, but also his own career is part of that phenomenon. And I thought that was really interesting because, with the exception of Jerry Marsden and perhaps The Searchers, and Mike Pender's written a quite interesting book about that too. Jerry, I think, has yet to do the definitive book about himself, but there's very little that looks at the other people who are in that circle in this kind of depth. So that was the first thing. But the second thing was, and I really learned a lot from Billy about this, when those bands were out on tour in the 60s, they weren't touring as pop shows. They were part of Variety. And the people that Billy was working with were Max Wall, Monsieur Eddie Gray, all the kind of slightly pre-war, just post-war comedians. There's a wonderful half chapter about being on stage with Tommy Cooper.
Fantastic.
And I found that insight into the world of Variety. I mean, funnily enough, the first time I met Peter Noone, he was here where I live in Oxford, playing Sinbad in Sinbad the Sailor in the pantomime.
Yeah.
And I was sent round by one of the magazines to go and interview him. And I'm backstage talking to Herman and the Hermits, who are basically just doing a completely wooden version of There's a Kind of Hush in the middle of a show that's about Sinbad and pirates. And the chief pirate was Bernard Cribbins. I mean, it's just amazing. And the pantomime Dane was Billy Dainty, which again is a link back.
Billy Dainty, there's a name I haven't heard for years. Blimey. It's funny, if you watch some of those, I'm a big fan of rock bands making films. And obviously in the sort of late 60s and the 70s, they were all a bit psychedelic and a bit arty. But if you look at some of the early films, you forget the Beatles stuff, but the Herman's Hermits films, you're right, they are kind of like a big screen pantomime, aren't they? There's something, not quite Carry On, but very, very British and that links back to that Variety. It's that kind of stepping stone between Variety and rock.
If we step back to Nielsen for a minute, of course, the great film there is Son of Dracula, which Ringo directed and produced. It's a dreadful film.
I've never been able to sit through it, and I love watching Ringo movies. I've sat through Caveman. I've never been able to sit through the Dracula movie.
Well, the best bit of the Dracula movie is the nightclub scene where Harry is performing, and the band is Keith Moon, Jim Keltner, so two drummers at different times. There's Klaus Furman, there's Peter Frampton. It's an absolutely amazing all-star band on screen, and although some of it's mimed to tracks off the Richard Perry albums, some of it's not, and it's great. And of course, the other great film that Ringo made is the one with Mark Bolan.
Yeah, Born to Boogie.
Fantastic film.
So listen, these are the two books you've got to buy, guys. This is your homework. Nielsen, The Life of a Singer Songwriter. Do You Want to Know a Secret? The autobiography of Billy J. Kramer. Both, Alyn Shipton's pen is very heavy on the paper. ALYN. You can go to alynshipton.co.uk to look at all the other bits and pieces. What's next, Alan? Do you have a project that you're kind of excited about, or are you taking a little break?
No, I'm going back to jazz for a bit now. I'm writing a book about, well, actually two things. The very first book I did on the jazz front was the autobiography of an amazing guy in New Orleans called Danny Barker. And Danny was a sort of one-man history of jazz, and he worked with all the bands back in the day, in the beginning of jazz in New Orleans. Then he was on the road with Cab Calloway's big band. Then he went back to New Orleans and became a sort of father figure of the music. And in 1986, we did his autobiography. And then I had that luxury that very few people have. I got together with him again and said, if you had the chance to do this book all over again, what would you do? And we taped hours of interviews. And now the new edition is coming out, sadly, nearly 20 years after his death. But it's all the things that he'd like to have put in it at the time and didn't. And there's a new edition of that coming out later this year. So that's great. And then the other book I'm doing, which is a much bigger project, is about the relationship between visual art and jazz. So you've got all these amazing painters like Magritte, Matisse, Mondrian, who are kind of influenced by jazz. And then you've, on the other hand, got a lot of jazz musicians influenced by art. Yeah. So that's a slightly heavyweight intellectual book, but that's the next biggie.
Well, as someone who's been trying for years to get the discipline to sit down and write one book, to hear you so busy makes me completely sick and jealous. Alan, but thank you so much for sending me these. They're an absolute joy, and I really appreciate you coming on tonight. Thank you.
Ian, it's been great. Lovely to talk to you, and thanks so much for your enthusiasm for Harry.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. It's Alyn Shipton. Let me just spell the name again, dear listener, before we go to a break, because I want to make sure, and I know we're not doing Twitter tonight, but I will tweet the link. Alyn Shipton, ALYN. Nielsen, The Life of a Singer Songwriter. It really is. It's a joy, and like I say, I've struggled to get into. Well, and we'll put that out as a podcast. We'll put that out as a special podcast. I've been struggling to get into Nielsen, and this book has just really. I find it the saddest story. The saddest story. Just so much talent, both as a songwriter and vocally. His voice ruined by cocaine and brandy. Flipping heck.
Across the UK, online and on DAB.
A radio star is born.
You're going to love
Talk Radio. Talk Radio. Talk Radio. Talk Radio. Talk Radio. Talk Radio. Talk Radio.